Yes, so I'm delighted to be joined by Toby Young. So that's a Spectator columnist and the associate editor of Quillette. Is that right?
Yeah.
And of course, formerly involved with quite a few other projects, very prominent Brexiteer. So, Toby, thank you very much for your time. So the first question, obviously, is we now have Boris as Prime Minister. Are you now confident as a Brexiteer that Brexit is going to take place on October 31st?
I'd say I'm about 60% confident that Brexit will take place by October 31st. And the reason I say that is not because I doubt Boris's resolve. I do believe that he is absolutely determined to do everything he can to take us out, deal or no deal, by October 31st. The reason I'm not more certain than that is because I do think that the Remainers will do whatever they can to try and obstruct him. And I don't believe they'll be constrained by constitutional precedent. And the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, has made it very clear that he's prepared to bend the rules to help the Remainers do whatever they can to obstruct Brexit. I'm reasonably confident that they won't be able to obstruct Brexit, but not 100% confident.
I mean, do you think that regardless of whether Brexit happens or not on October 31st, we're heading for an autumn general election, either before or after Brexit? Is that kind of like your working assumption?
Um, I think there probably will be an election this autumn, but one of the reasons I'm slightly hesitant is because I don't think the Labour Party uh, want that to be a general election before we've left. They say they do. They say they want to stop a no deal Brexit, but I don't think they do in reality. I think that Corbyn and MacDonald and their circle have calculated that actually, if there's a general election after we've left, that will be better for Labour than if there's a general election before we've left. Because at the moment, if there's a general election, they'll bleed a lot of support to the Lib Dems, to the Greens, to other unequivocally pro-Remain parties. Whereas I think they hope that once we've left, once that issue's been resolved, a lot of those waverers and refugees will come back to the Labour fold.
I mean, if Parliament does manage to thwart Brexit on October 31st and potentially beyond that, and what do you think that would say about British democracy?
I think British democracy has been under assault for the past 3 years. Um, Lots of the participants in the EU referendum debate on the Remain side said that it was a one-off and that all sides would be bound by the result. And there's numerous video evidence of them saying that. And after they lost, they changed their minds and said, "Oh, it wasn't a proper election," or the public who voted to leave didn't know what they were voting for, or lots of the people who voted for leave were very old and therefore their vote should be discounted, and so on and so forth. Which shows, I think, a contempt for democracy and a contempt for the British people. And what's extraordinary about the situation we currently find ourselves in is that the vast majority of MPs voted to trigger Article 50, knowing that that meant we'd have to leave at the end of the Article 50 process, deal or no deal. And now they appear to have, some of them anyway, changed their minds. But having stood on a platform in the 2017 general election of honouring the referendum result, it seems to me that they can't now go back on it. If they stood on that platform, if they said they were in favour of Brexit, they weren't going to frustrate it, and that after the Article 50 process they'd support leaving it now, and that's the basis on which they were elected to Parliament. And something like 94% of the people who voted in the 2017 general election voted for parties saying they would honour the referendum result. So for them to now go back on that and say, well, actually, we've changed our minds, is, I think, very undemocratic.
I mean, if there is an autumn election, obviously at the moment the Conservative Party contains a small number of people who are either openly advocating a second referendum or who are generally very opposed to no deal Brexit. If there is an autumn election, do you think that people like Dominic Green should be allowed to stand on the Conservative ticket?
I think if there's a general election before we've left, then it's going to be difficult, a big ask to say to Conservative members and Conservative activists, you have to campaign for incumbent Conservative MPs like Dominic Grieve, who are actively trying to frustrate Brexit. And it's also going to be difficult, I think, for Boris Johnson. Is he going to allow some Conservative MPs to stand under the Conservative banner if they're actively trying to frustrate his number one policy objective? So I think that will put the Conservative Party in a tricky position. If the general election is after we've left, I think it's less of a concern. I think if there is a general election before we've left, I think there has to be some kind of alliance between Brexit supporting factions within each of the major political parties, including the Labour Party. I don't
like
think
a coupon style system, or
I don't think there's going to be a coupon style arrangement. I don't think there can be a formal pact between the Brexit Party, the Conservative Party, let alone the Labour Party. And Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage have ruled that out. And I think we have to take that at face value. But I think nonetheless there could be a grassroots, bottom-up tactical voting alliance. Something like what the People's Vote campaign is saying they want to organise. What the People's Vote campaign have said they want to do is in 100 marginal constituencies, they're going to urge people who want to remain or want a second referendum to vote for the candidate in that constituency that supports Remain or a second referendum and is most likely to win, regardless of which party they're linked to. So there ought to be an equivalent campaign on the Brexit side, a campaign which tells people who support Brexit, regardless of which party they're members of or which party they normally support, saying, this is the Brexit supporting candidate you should vote for in your constituency if you want us to leave by October 31st. I think that given that there are going to be Remain forces who will have organised something like that, if there's a general election before we left, there has to be the equivalent on the Brexit side. And I think that could mitigate some of the potential damage of the divisions between the various different pro-Brexit candidates in particular constituencies. And I think in Dominic Grieve's constituency, for instance, if he does stand under a Conservative banner and there is a general election before we've left, then I would certainly be urging people to support the Brexit Party candidate in that constituency. And I'd hope that there could be an organisation that could convey that message to Brexit supporting Tories in that constituency. You want us to leave? Don't vote for Dominic Grieve. In this one instance, vote for the Brexit Party candidate. And in some constituencies, the candidate that will be asking, or the campaign will be asking pro-Brexit supporting voters to vote for will be the Labour Party candidate. Very few, but in some cases.
I mean, obviously, there were some Brexit supporters who say that obviously the Brexit Party's managed to push the Tories back into backing a no-deal Brexit. But at that point, they've kind of done their job, and if they stand across the country, the net result will be a Remain victory. I mean, do you think that that this kind of alliance could mitigate that, or do you think that would still be a real problem with the Brexit Party and the Tories competing for the same vote?
I do think that if there's a general election before we've left, that the fact that the Brexit Party will be fielding candidates in some constituencies where, without them, the Conservatives will win, is a problem. I think that even though Boris has managed to bring probably most of the people who voted for the Brexit Party in the most recent European election, but who would otherwise have voted Conservative, I think he's managed to bring most of those people back into the Conservative fold. But the pro-Brexit parts of the electorate are still divided enough for that to have an impact, I think, on the general election result. That's also true of the pro-Remain forces. So they're divided between the Labour Party, the Green Party, the Lib Dems, the Liberal Nationalist parties, and so forth. And it's probably more of a disadvantage for them than it is for the Tories. I think the pro-Brexit forces are more united than the pro-Remain forces. But it's still, I think, a risk that if there is a general election before we've left, and if the Brexit Party field candidates in enough constituencies, it's possible that the division amongst the Brexit supporting voters will allow a minority of Remain supporting voters to come up through the middle. And I think the way to mitigate that is to create some kind of tactical voting alliance, which has an authoritative figure promoting it, a really good website, a really good grassroots campaign that can tell people which candidate they should vote for in their constituency if they want to guarantee that we'll leave on October 31st. And if there is a general election, we probably won't get a great deal of notice, and we won't have much time to put together an alliance of that kind. So I think we probably need to start thinking about that now. So in case there is a general election before we've left, we have an embryonic plan in place already.
I mean, so obviously the European Commission is going to get a new president, the former German defence minister, who's explicitly called for a United States of Europe. I mean, do you think that's kind of like a gift to Brexiteers? And do you think it reinforces the argument that the status quo isn't an option? I.e., either we leave or we slowly and gradually integrate more into a federal Europe?
I think that I think if there was a second referendum, I think that the Remainers would probably do worse than they did 3 years ago, because lots of the arguments that people on the Leave side, like me, were making then, which were disputed by the Remainers, such as the federal project is alive and well, the people who are running the EU want there to be a United States of Europe, they want to create an EU army, they want everyone to be in the euro in due course, and so on and so forth. They don't want Britain to have this kind of semi-detached relationship with the European Union. They want, if you remember, the European Union to be fully integrated into the federal project. A lot of those arguments we were making, which were disputed by people on the Remain side, I think it would be much harder for them to dispute now. I also think that the EU have behaved so badly during the 3 year period since we voted to leave, and have treated us with such contempt and have offered us such a poor deal, that will have, I think, persuaded some people who did vote Remain in 2016 that actually, we don't want to be part of this club anymore. So I think if there was a second referendum, I think in all likelihood Leave would win by an even greater margin than they did 3 years ago. But that's not to say that there ought to be a second referendum. I think one referendum was sufficient. When that referendum took place, we weren't told it would be the best out of three, and we already know because the leaders of the Green Party and the Lib Dems have both said, they've both been completely open about this. Even if the result in a second referendum was an even greater victory for Leave, they still wouldn't accept it. I mean, they would only accept a result which said that we wanted to remain. So what's the point?
Brexit, I mean, kind of however you think of it, is a radical change. Some have called it a revolution. And one of the things about revolutions, they don't always benefit the people who initiate them, I mean, throughout history. Do you think there's a risk that the final beneficiary of the Brexit revolution will turn out to be Corbynites? Is there a risk that Brexit will end up putting Corbyn into number 10?
I think there is a risk that circumstances could conspire, a perfect storm, to catapult Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. And I'm certainly concerned about that. If you take the predictions of the Project Fear Remainers about the economic consequences of a no-deal Brexit seriously, then you can imagine a scenario. Let's suppose we leave with no deal on October 31st, the economy goes into recession, about a year after that there's a general election. You can imagine, in those circumstances, it's possible that the Labour Party might do well enough, maybe not to win an overall majority, but maybe to form a minority government propped up by the SNP. We heard recently John McDonnell say that he was willing to countenance a second independence referendum in Scotland, and you can imagine circumstances in which a deal was made between the Labour Party and the SNP, whereby, provided the Labour Party allowed an independence referendum to take place, the SNP would allow a minority Labour government to do whatever it liked. And that's alarming. That prospect is obviously extremely alarming for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that when he was interviewed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival recently, John McDonnell said that he wanted to, if Labour won power, he would change the law to enable the Labour Party to arrest and imprison its political opponents. Now, he said it with a sort of twinkle in his eye, as if to say, I'm not being wholly serious, but I think we need to take those kinds of things very seriously. If Labour is elected, changes the law and then starts locking up its political opponents, which is after all what socialist governments have done for time immemorial, I think we shouldn't be surprised and shocked. And John McDonnell said, "Look, I told you I was going to do this. This is what I'm doing. You voted for me. I have the mandate to do this." So I think we need to take those sorts of threats very seriously. I mean, that would be one of many disastrous consequences of Jeremy Corbyn getting his hands on the levers of power. The other real risk is that, as we've seen I think some people on my side of the aisle say, um, maybe it wouldn't be too disastrous if there was a Labour government, because even though it would be absolutely catastrophic for our economy, they'd do what they can to undermine democracy, they'd tilt the playing field in their favour in various underhand ways. They'd set up they'd introduce state regulation of the press. They'd try and make it illegal to criticise the government and so on and so forth. But people think, well, maybe that wouldn't be so disastrous because after a few years of such a terrible government, it would permanently toxify the Labour brand, and after that, no one would ever vote for the Labour Party again. The problem with that is that's probably what people said in 2017 on the eve of the Bolsheviks seizing power. They thought, well, maybe we should let them form a government, and they'll do so disastrously. After that, everyone will vote for us.
Yeah.
But there was no after that, or at least there wasn't any after that for almost 100 years. Once Marxists seize the levers of power, they're very reluctant to let go, and they'll do whatever they possibly can to hold on to that power, including changing the law, ignoring our democratic traditions, destroying our institutions, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to be very wary of even countenancing a minority Labour government. Once Corbyn has got his horny hands on the levers of power, it's going to be very difficult to prise them away.
Yeah, obviously you've alluded to this earlier, but when you hear quotes from John McDonnell, like so obviously he praised the bombs and bullets of the IRA, he once said that parliamentary democracy isn't working for us. When you hear Corbyn praising Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends, do you think there are really fundamental questions about the current Labour leadership's commitment to democracy?
I think that the Labour Party has been taken over by an extremist Marxist faction. And everything that we find absolutely abhorrent about the current Labour Party leadership, such as Jeremy Corbyn's support for Hezbollah and Hamas, the fact that he and John McDonnell were sympathetic to the IRA, their desire to dismantle NATO, to destroy our special relationship with the United States, our closest ally. I think one of the many freakish, extraordinary things I've heard is that one of the things Labour would do in its first 100 days in office is replace the special relationship between Britain and the United States with a special relationship between Britain and Cuba, which on the face of it is sort of comic, but it's actually what they do, and it would be funny in a kind of Citizen Smith-like satire of kind of hard left socialism. But if it actually happens, it won't be funny. It'll be an absolute catastrophe. And the reason the Labour Party leadership has these abhorrent characteristics is because they are a hard left, extremist, Marxist faction. They have absolutely no love for this country. Jeremy Corbyn refused to sing the national anthem. He probably doesn't know the words of the national anthem. In every case, when Britain has been at loggerheads with a foreign power, whether it be Argentina, Iran, Corbyn has always sided with the enemies of this country. It would be like electing Stalin Prime Minister, in 1939. I mean, it's just it beggars belief, and I do take some comfort from the fact that the Labour Party are doing incredibly poorly in the polls. They're bumping along at something like 21-22%. They almost lost their deposit in the Brecon and Radnorshire by-election. You think that the British public voted for the Labour Party in much greater numbers than expected in 2017 because no one thought there was the slightest risk that Corbyn could become Prime Minister. It was a protest vote, a way of trying to reduce the Conservatives' majority, which they thought was inevitable. So I trust, I have faith that even if the consequences of a no deal Brexit were as bad as the no deal doomsayers are predicting, and I don't think they will be for a second, but even if they are, I think have enough confidence in the British public that they wouldn't place a terrorist loving, anti Semitic, Britain hating, Marxist extremist in Downing Street. I still think that even in those circumstances, they'd prefer Boris Johnson.
Yeah. I mean, if we did have a Labour government under its present leadership, obviously, as you mentioned, its opposition to NATO, its hostility to the United States, do you think it would essentially be Britain dropping out of the Western Alliance for the first time since 1945?
I think the Western Alliance, which has preserved freedom and democracy throughout the 20th century, and certainly since 1945, would be in greater jeopardy if Corbyn became Prime Minister than it ever has been before. And I think that would be a gift to the enemies of the West. It would be a gift to Iran. It would be a gift to Putin. It would be a gift to China. That's one of many reasons why Corbyn becoming Prime Minister would be absolutely catastrophic. It wouldn't just endanger freedom and democracy in the United Kingdom. It would endanger freedom and democracy across the West.
I mean, changing the subject slightly, do you think there's currently a culture war taking place in Western societies, especially Anglophile societies? And how much does that worry you?
I think we are in the midst of a culture war. And I think many of the forms that it takes are people trying to undermine the values and traditions and institutions on which our peace and prosperity rests on. And it's almost like the West is committing suicide. It's almost as if some people in the West, often very educated people, have become gripped by a suicide cult, and they want to undermine and destroy all those things that have made the West so successful. They want us to give away our prosperity. They want us to take down our borders. They want to destroy the values of the Enlightenment on which our democracy, our economic system rest. And it's perplexing for those who aren't on their side in the culture war. You kind of think, well, why do you want Britain, America, other countries in the Anglosphere to become more like basket case countries, countries which are on the verge of becoming failed states? Why do you want Britain to become more like Venezuela? And, for years, Jeremy Corbyn said that Hugo Chavez, the leader of Venezuela until recently, was a role model, and that he'd shown there was a new and better way. Venezuela is now an absolute basket case. Inflation in Venezuela last year was more than 1,000,000%. People are desperate to try and get out of Venezuela. There is a refugee crisis in the countries surrounding Venezuela because so many people are trying to escape Venezuela. It just seems extraordinary to me that, we know historically every time socialism has been tried, it begins with lots of highfalutin language about the international brotherhood of man and ends with people having to break into zoos in order to eat the animals because the economy collapses and people are starving to death. We've seen it again and again and again, and people say, oh, that's not true socialism. Well, it's always true socialism until it goes wrong, and then, oh, well, they didn't get it quite right. Trust us, we'll get it right. No, I wouldn't trust anyone to get it right. And the idea that is a superior system to our system, that capitalism is inferior to socialism. It's just, look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea. And yet I do think that there are nonetheless lots of people, lots of very educated, intelligent people across the West who still believe that there's something morally suspect about the West. There's something dubious and morally suspect about capitalism, about our economic system, about free markets, in spite of the prosperity they've created. The people often making these arguments, the people denouncing our system and who want the West to dismantle the institutions on which that system depends, they're often clutching iPhones. They've got a cup of Starbucks coffee, tucked under their arm. They're wearing Nike t-shirts. The contradiction is staring them in the face, and yet they don't realise it. So yeah, we are in the midst of a culture war, and I think we have to take it seriously, because if we don't, I think we could see the collapse of our way of life.
Yeah. Just one final question. Obviously, you alluded earlier to Enlightenment values and Western values, and I think most people would agree one of the fundamental Western values is freedom of speech. Are you particularly concerned about what's happening in freedom of speech, particularly within universities and academia? And do you have any plans to combat them?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is the foundational value on which all the other values that are peace and prosperity depend on. Without freedom of speech, you can't have liberal democracy. And it is under assault. It's under assault wherever you look. It's under assault in universities, it's under assault in schools, it's under assault in the media. The police now are, questioning people for misgendering on Twitter. I mean, it's ludicrous. We're in the midst of a knife crime epidemic. And what are the police doing about this? They've abandoned stop and search, and instead they're devoting valuable police resources to investigating people suspected not even of committing hate crimes, but of hate incidents. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. We are, I think, facing a crisis of free speech. And one of the things I'd like to do, and I wrote about this recently, is to create a free speech trade union, which stands up for free speech and which stands up for people who find themselves being persecuted, under assault, simply for speaking their mind because what they've said is politically incorrect or outside the Overton window. And lots of people, since I wrote that piece, have said, "You're right, how can I help?" And if anyone watching this would like to get involved, email me on jsmillsociety@gmail.com. That's jsmillsociety@gmail.com. I'm not sure whether that will be the name of the organisation, but J.S. Mill, of course, was an English political philosopher who wrote a book called On Liberty, amongst other things, which is one of the great seminal essays setting out the case for freedom of speech and intellectual freedom.
Yeah. Well, Toby, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much for your time.